Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix, and I'll be reading a story called Earth in a series that I'm calling Swamp Castle. Merchants were allowed everywhere that other humans weren't. That still didn't stop bandits from trying to kill them whenever they could. But Mirthy didn't really care about that as he ran into the Woodhaven. It was risky. In fact, it was probably insane, but the bandits were more the immediate problem. He didn't get far. A spear touched his throat, and he saw one of the wild men waiting to plunge it into him. He closed his eyes and expected the worst, but instead the wilder just went onward, plunging it past him as the wilder rode his emerald stag and buried his spear into the bandit leader. With a hue and a cry, half a dozen wilders rose up from the foliage surrounding the caravan to kill the bandits. Both forces had been equally deadly, no match for their intended prey. For the bandits had killed the rest of the caravan. Mirthy couldn't understand how they had been so effective so quickly, or why they had been so bloodthirsty. But equally frightening was the response by the wilders, who destroyed the bandits in half the time, with almost no noise save their initial war cry. Mirthy waited for them to acknowledge him somehow, but they never did. The wilders picked at the bodies of the bandits, pretending like the merchants didn't even exist, and then moved back into the forest like they'd never been there in the first place. He'd heard rumors that the wilders had been human once, changed by the Woodhaven over time into something else. Then again, that was the story they said about most people who lived beyond the veil. Generally, Mirthy didn't put much stock in most stories that made humans sound better than others, but now he was at least curious. He'd met wilders, dwarves, and merfolk, and each had been at least borne a passing resemblance to humanity. There might indeed be some truth to the rumors. He didn't know. Mirthy was no scholar of antiquities. He had the unfortunate task of going through what was left of the caravan's things. His first task was survival, so he retrieved all the food and water he could carry. His second task was to find the trader's medallion that the caravan leader had carried. Without it, he or any human found beyond the veil could be killed or enslaved with ease. Then, and only then, did he allow himself the luxurious sentiment. He had a lot of dead people to bury, and little time to do it in. Mirthy didn't dare travel along the road. The bandits all had kin in the toll-keepers, and as soon as they heard that the caravan had been killed, they'd be looking to retaliate. That meant he had to walk in the woods with the road in sight, and then try and walk around the toll village to the next village beyond. Normally this was suicide, but since the wilders hadn't killed him for entering the woods when they'd attacked the bandits, he assumed that they would let him through. Assume. That was a lot of assume. Mirthy had heard all kinds of stories about them. Some of them were crazy. Most of them were filled with blood, death, and gore. They were not pleasant things, that much was certain, but he really didn't have any choice. Once he'd buried the last of them, he headed into the woods. The woods were alive. Everyone knew that. Mirthy didn't understand how all the trees and animals and other things, he shuddered when he thought about the other things, could be alive themselves and yet also have some part of them that was shared with the woods. It wasn't natural, but he could feel it. And he could feel that it didn't like him. It wasn't that it was a seething hatred. It was more to Mirthy like he was an annoying bit of gristle, and the forest really wanted to dig him out with a toothpick. He could feel the whole wood infusing him, invigorating him, and yet at the same time he could feel it trying to break down the barriers in his mind. He didn't even know he'd had barriers to break. He tried to moving his thoughts to the road ahead. He tried to stay in sight of the road at all times or he would get lost, and getting lost in these woods was a bad thing. He'd heard that once the woods had liked humans and welcomed them, but that was before the Sundering. Now the woods only accepted the wilders. The sun began to set. He wasn't sure if it was wiser to stay where he was or move along blindly in the darkness, but he knew that either was a dangerous choice. He saw the light ahead, and that made him think that that was the next toll station. The bandits' kin would be there. Once he was past them, he would be able to return to the road. 2 hours later, it was entirely dark. He could hear the music and the laughter from where he was. Mirthy doubted they'd be celebrating if they knew what the wilds had done to their kin. Mirthy stumbled along, not sure where to go. He had tried climbing one of the trees, but felt a biting sensation in his hand. He had to pull it back. There wasn't any blood, but it was a little red with irritation. Apparently, the trees did not want to be climbed. Eventually, he found the road again. He could see the bits of their lights from where he was, but now studiously avoided touching any of the trees for more than a few seconds. Still, he allowed himself a smidgen of hope. Carefully, ever so carefully, he moved past the toll-keepers. Then he heard an anxious shout to his right and looked around. He saw the painted face of one of the toll-keepers, and heard the toll-keeper shouting back to his fellows celebrating below. The music immediately died, and the primeval sounds of the forest took over. Mirthy didn't even stop to think. He knew that if he stayed where he was, he would be dead. Leaving any hope of light from the fires behind, he ran as fast as he could, with nothing but the aurora in the sky to guide his way, which frequently was blocked out by the leaves of the trees. His foot kicked a rock, sending shock waves of pain up his leg and into his spine. He nearly collapsed, but kept moving forward. The reptile part of his brain forced him forward. He saw shapes moving in the darkness ahead and ran around them. One of them swept at him with what he thought was a paw. Mirthy could barely hear his pursuers over his heavy breathing. And then he could run no more. He collapsed onto the roots of one of the horrible orange-barked trees and ignored the increasing burning sensation it metered into his cheek. He had to rest, and he couldn't move at all. Then he noticed. The sounds of pursuit had stopped. It was only then that the full horror of what he had done fell upon him. The forest went for more than 100 miles in every direction. It was absolutely filled with things that people that wanted to kill him, and he had no idea which direction he was to go in. In short, he was as good as dead. He should have waited for the toll-keeper to flay him alive. At least it would have been quicker than whatever dread awaited him now. Then came the pounding of the drums. It made no sense to him, because the toll-keepers were nowhere in sight. Were they trying to flush him out? Or was it the wilders? Or was it his own imagination? The sheer solitude was certainly enough to drive him to it. Alone and in the wilderness, he knew that he was the only human for hundreds of miles. In fact, given the lateness of the trading season, he might be the only human for thousands. Mirthy stepped over a particularly large segment of tree stump that seemed to move in the shadows of dream that lingered in the base of his mind. The fear kept him awake, fear that matched the pounding of his heart. The leaves of the trees had no more beautiful shades for him, but in his self-imposed madness began to take on the red glow of the blood of the earth. It was as if the world itself was pushing its blood up through the roots of the trees and spreading it out amongst the rotting, shiny, wet vibrance of each leaf, hoping to spurt like acid upon whatever hapless intruder might stumble by. Was it in his own mind, or was it simply only visible like this in the deep woods? They had camped in the toll areas for 5 nights before coming, always keeping near the firelight. The caravan had thought itself safe by following the rules, only to find out after 6 toll stations that sometimes the rules changed. Sometimes individual tolls could turn bandit, and while the wilders might punish the bandits involved, they didn't really work to protect the caravans that traveled through them either. That had given them all a choice: press forward or go back. They had all worked 7 years to arrange the payments and cargo for this voyage. They had all staked their entire futures and fortunes on this event, and that meant prosperity not only for them, but for the rest of their family back home. It wasn't really a question. Justice might seem subjective. After all, from the wilders' perspective, what they had done for the caravan was justice. The killers had been killed. But from the caravan's perspective, it wasn't. It seemed quite objective to Mirthy. He felt anger. Anger at the forest that wanted him dead, and even more anger at the toll-keepers. He felt anger at the gods for their absolutely pathetic indifference towards his plight or the ability to do anything about it. Rationally speaking, he knew that if he prayed on the subject, he might get the attention of one of them, but any gods that would be safe to deal with were far in distance, quite weak in this place. The gods of the trees would be at their strongest here. Instead, some whispered that the wild woods were a place that not even gods dared go. But few would dare admit such a thing in the presence of the gods, major or minor. Carefully, with deliberate precisions, he moved on. If he slept, who knew if one of the roots of the trees might quietly wrap itself around his ankle while he slept, taking his blood to sate his thirst. The feeling of life and vigor he had felt upon entering this place now made him nauseous. It was too much. Nature disgusted him and he wanted to burn everything and anything. The wood was alive, and he loved it and yet hated it at the same time. He knew somehow that at dawn it would be more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. Was that subjective or objective? It didn't matter. Sleep didn't matter. Survival mattered. Survival mattered getting back onto the road and finishing what he could of the trading mission. He would not let the bandits win. He was even more aware when sleep took him. He walked for hours and hours, and then the waking world suddenly merged into the dreaming world, and he was dreamed of walking through the trees and waking upon the sunset. Each dream became more real than the last until he really had no way of knowing once he woke what was the dream and what was reality. And yet the pain he felt on the surface of the tree when he put his hand on it seemed real enough. Would that have woken him? In the end, it didn't matter. The sun had risen, and the forest was indeed beautiful. The red and orange seemed mixed with the most emerald shade of green that Mirthy had ever seen. He was in a living jewelry store, each arboreal snowflake manifesting itself in a different glorious sundance. Today would be a good day. He knew it. Confidence bolstered his madness, reassured the reptile brain parts of his mind. The primal surging of the forest around him buzzed his head and filled him with rapturous thoughts of living and the dead. He gazed around him for some frame of reference while taking a deep swig of his canteen. The water was sweet as it was colorful. He could feel the way it sounded between the aisles of the sea. Not that there was an ocean here, of course, but that was beside the point. The point being, did he care? He cared. He knew deep down that he did. He knew that was all he knew, and drove the point deep within himself and projected it outward, like a spirit lance to protect himself and his sanctity from the overwhelming sensations of life and emotion around him. It was enough, though it was not perfect. By finding himself, his center, his wall, Mirthy found direction. It was subtle at first, and then louder and larger in his mind. He felt a tugging, a distant tingling in the center of his being, urging him at greater and greater speed towards an unseen destination. Mirthy began to run. Though he did not know what he was running for, he knew that he had to get there quickly. The wood seemed benevolent for a time, as if it were eager to have him get there. The wood spoke with no words and barely a feeling. It was more of a quiet way, and the wind moved between the leaves or danced in the treetops at the same breeze moved back and forth. He was one with nature, and it accepted him. Shortly and for a time, by defining himself, he had integrated himself, and now he would see where that led. And then he woke up a second time. He realized that he had been awake, but that something heavy was pressing itself onto his consciousness, calling out to him, bringing him here. He felt lucid. No, not true. He felt less lucid, but that allowed him to think more human thoughts. He was in some kind of a city. It was quiet, far too quiet. In fact, as he listened, he could tell that even his breathing was muted by something. It was serene, reverent even, like the shrines to even more stately gods back home. But it held a quiet sense of mourning as well. Whoever had lived here hadn't been the Wilders. The doors were all too short, about waist high. The wall was low, about up to his neck. But as he approached, he could look and see a sea of tiny little houses, though he spotted a larger human-sized building in the back. He also noticed that the walls had not worn away with the passage of time. In fact, if it hadn't been for the large amount of dust on top of the wall, he would have no way of knowing if the city had been built 6 days or 6 centuries ago. In fact, he really still had no idea. Despite the clearing of his mind, he still felt something calling him inward. But as he approached, he noticed one of the warder symbols used by the Wilders to keep people on the road. They didn't want him to go into this house. A part of him wanted to ignore the warning, but the fact was, he wasn't dead yet, despite the hostility that the forest felt toward him. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave. So he just moved around the edge of the wall, looking into the city and hoping he could see something else. He smelled the food before he saw it. Rounding the corner, he saw a small tray bulging with fruits and vegetables near the houses. He'd heard stories about the realm of the gods involving warnings against eating strange food. He'd heard no such things about the Wilders except drinking too much of their very powerful wine. He was hungry, and yet it was stupid. But he was very hungry, and yet it was incredibly stupid. With a supreme effort of will, he managed to pry himself away from the area and back into the forest. He did so reluctantly because now that he looked back, he saw a large ring of trees that acted almost like a warding wall. He was surprised he hadn't noticed it when he first arrived. Once he stepped through the trees, he felt the madness begin to return, but something more this time. It was anger over his refusal to eat the food that had been offered him. Immediately, he stepped back and things became normal again. What was going on? Did they want him to eat the food, or didn't they? Were they just toying with him? Looking at the round of the woods, he shouted, raising his hands in exasperation, "What do you want?" The woods did not reply. He moved towards the human-sized building and saw a door. There was no symbol on it, so he turned the knob and slowly moved it inward. Unsure what to find, he carefully stepped into the darkness. Instantly, a warm fire sprang to life in the corner. Mirthy found himself in a comfortable room with large pillows and wooden couches along the walls. Rich and detailed tapestries hung next to shining crystals, mounted into the wall which lit up along with the fire. There were several doors. He slowly moved into the room, not sure what to expect. After a few moments, he realized that it was just a room. He tried to move back towards the small door he'd seen on the side, nowhere near where the food was, so he opened the nearest door and walked inside. That door opened into a long hallway with dozens of other doors on either side. He walked about halfway down the corridor and opened one of the rooms. It was a quaint bedroom, larger than the cabin he'd been on the ship getting here. It had a large feather bed with quilted covers and a solid brass chamber pot. The carving in the walls and in the woodwork on the bed was absolutely exquisite, but it looked like portions of it had been worn away. But when he compared the uneven results to the untouched parts of the carvings, he realized instead that it had been filed off by a rather skilled and determined vandal. Then, at the end of the hallway, he entered the library. The walls were high and stacked with scrolls of rolled-up paper. There was no dust of any kind in the room, and there were human-sized doors, though the door that caught his attention was a little doll-sized door on the far side of the room. He immediately went to it, opened it up. Inside, he saw another of the warning signs used by the Wilders. At the same time, he felt something powerful pulling him inside. What was it? He ignored it and backed away. Then he smelled the food. He was at war with himself. Was he really that stupid? But what choice did he have? And to be fair, he was honestly curious. Mirthy crawled through the door, and for a moment he felt intense hatred, but that was quickly washed away by a sense of comfort and love. He took a quick look around and saw a room almost identical to the one he'd left, filled with books, but meant for a much smaller scale. Then he could see the food in the open doorway just beyond the tiny library. He crawled towards it. There was a large, bright orange crystal on one of the tables. It caught in the sunlight that poured through the upper windows. As Mirthy approached it, he could see dozens of black specks inside it. Could they be insects trapped in amber? He reached forward to touch it, and instantly his mind was filled with images. He was aware of something larger than himself trying to talk to him. No, that wasn't true. The forest had already been trying to do that. No, in this case, it was more than communication. It was sharing experiences with him. He felt something warm. It was like he was being cleansed with a wire brush inside of his bones, but somehow the pain felt like pleasure. A short while later, he felt something push his eyes out of his sockets. That actually hurt, but when he looked around, he saw that the room was just the way it had always been, and that his eyes were still his own. Then a split second later, images and experiences filled his mind. He didn't know much about the people who had once lived here, but he knew that they had been kind to humanity for a long time. Empires rose and fell, and they always sheltered humanity. They came to view this as a sacred trust. And so when something particularly bad happened to humanity, they not only helped, but opened the doors of their forest. Mirthy had heard about the legends of the Wilders once being human. It was apparently true. And then a hand burst through the window, shattering the glass. A voice inside his head was telling him to run. At first he couldn't tell whether it was the memories or reality, but the glass cut his face, and he knew that what he was facing was real. Blood dripped down his cheek and into the ashwood floor. He moved towards the door, but he saw the Wilder kneel down before him, its golden eyes full of rage and something else. The alien face took a moment to register, but Mirthy finally recognized that it's shame? Shame? Shame for... and the memories flooded into his mind. The guests had become presumptive. Generation after generation had forged them, changed them, made them something more, until they were only human in the vaguest of ways, but they became jealous of the power of their hosts. And like all jealous children, they took what they wanted and ate it. Mirthy struggled as much as he could. He squirmed and shouted to get free, but the grip of the Wilder was like iron. Now Mirthy understood. Now he knew what those who had been here had wanted the world to know. They had been betrayed. Their hospitality had been violated in the worst way, and the world had to know it. He would tell. They would all find out. They had to. And the last thing he saw was the wilder knife glinting in the hint of the lighting dawn. That last sentence was a little bit awkward. So, good story. Fantasy horror, hard to do. This story started out really, really freaking boring. I would give it a C. The writing and the imagery started to get there. Again, with the other story set in Spielglass, fascinating little details in this world I'm trying to create here. I understand why I wrote the short stories before I wrote the novel, or tried to write the novel and then abandoned the novel. It's different. Different is good, but sometimes too different is hard for people to connect to. And there's nothing about this particular fantasy setting that just draws me in. I mean, I kind of get it. It's kind of similar, kind of not similar to other things I've seen. I don't even know what to rate this story. I think overall I'm going to give it a B-. Parts of it worked really well, right? The slow madness, the slow reveal. I think I could write this better now. At about half the length, and do everything that this story did and better. Without all the little details, except for some of the little details. It's actually the little details that make the story a B- instead of a C. Some of the writing in this was when I started experimenting, incorporating more of my poetry into my prose. It's become more secondhand and natural, and something I do in edit passes. But frankly, it works. It's still very kludgy in this, but when you compare it to some of my earlier writing, I understand why the supposed experts said that my craft was, well, frankly, terrible. It's not as bad as it was. Practice and more practice has shown itself over time. Mirthy himself is a very passive character. There's a lot of, some of the details about the trading caravan, it works, but other things leap out to me, like that, in the lens of time are kind of obvious. Like, for a trading mission, okay, it takes food and a trading medallion, but nothing else, like not even small valuable objects that he can sell. I mean, I get that an entire trade caravan isn't going to have enough to sell, but, just surviving when you're a merchant probably isn't going to be enough, especially when they already took a horrible risk to continue going on. The other thing that's interesting is I'm fascinated by some of the implied setting details here, and I actually do the exact opposite of too much info dump, because what is it exactly that's causing the decay of these merchant routes that is causing these toll villages to turn on people and become bandits and risk these wilders killing them? It doesn't say, and to a certain degree you don't know, but at least a couple more details, like the decline of the empire, or in the lens of time, I don't remember off the top of my head what it is in the setting. I certainly remember at a super, super high level, which is cycles of XYZ race coming on, and humans aren't necessarily the latest race, right? They usually are, but if it's the elves in decline and the dwarves in decline, then why can't humans be the ones in decline for once? And that's one of the things about the setting that I liked and that was interesting, but and it worked kind of in the horror, but at the same time, if I'm going to do that, I probably should make the humans a little bit more like the humans from Gondor, or, the high men of the Middle Earth, which Mirthy is definitely not. Mirthy is just as your garden variety human, more concerned with tomorrow than anything else. But, in general, like I said, I liked it. It has a few things that need to be fixed, but nothing that cannot be fixed.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
to fight the forces of evil!